Hi,
Can
good
you speak?
evening, everybody. Welcome to the sixth of our AI Thoughts talk. Given the way AI development is speeding up across the globe, there is a lot of concern about the the rampant growth of AI, and standards and bodies are now looking at trying to come out with defining not just regulation, but how AI should be ethically and responsibly developed. ISO, in fact, is coming out with a whole lot of standards around that, both concerning management of data, privacy, as well as AI development standards. I'll leave it to Anil, who's an expert on this. He's spent a lot of his years uh, helping uh, implement a lot of standards across a lot of enterprises. And not just that, he's also, I think, been a key contributor to some of the standards bodies.
So, thank you very much, Divakar. I guess this is the first time I'm presenting here. Good evening, everyone, and good morning if you're some of the coast at this point of time. What we want to do is this time is to explore some of the perspectives uh, limited to various factors. And what we'll do is as per the defined uh, agenda. So let me bring that agenda slide. If you're able to see the agenda, what we plan to do is examine some of the factors for an organization to consider before deploying AI solutions. And the factors which we'll be looking at are laws, regulations, and standards. But we'll briefly look at those aspects. My primary focus is going to be on standards, and how do you derive some of the organization frameworks from the standards and some of the best practices. So we'll do that. We'll look at overall platter when it comes to this particular aspect. We look at international standards pertinent to field of AI. I would then jump into what is called as ISO 42000 2023 standard, which is essentially a AIMS, Artificial Intelligence Management Standard. Prior to that, what I'll do is I will talk about some of the characteristics of management systems. We will then explore some interconnection between different standards, and that is very important because there are too many standards which are there, which are employed at any given point of time, especially on the IT side. So we'll look at how they bring a little harmony when it comes to the standards. And then we'll look at an approach to translate some of this into way of developing strategies, policies, processes, and framework. And then lastly, we'll discuss on construction of something called as an assessment framework. Now, all this is based on probably my experience and a little bit of research which I've done in the past. And of course, we have quite a few other experts here who will talk about this aspect whenever we do consider some of the points which are there. I'm getting into the next slide, and I will skim through the slides because they're pretty explanatory. What we'll do is we'll explore here dimensions. And one of the initial dimensions which we will look at is pertaining to laws, legislations, regulations, or acts as they're called. And these elements establish typically legal and statutory requirements, set boundaries around ethical standards, and that encompass issues like privacy, transparency, accountability. And you can clearly see some examples there. And I have just noted down few examples. There are quite a few examples. So Europe AI Act or GDPR, which we all know, Privacy Act, which is also very important. There is something called as Accountability Act, and so on and so forth. Just for your information, I did a little research and we found that around 22 countries who have so far defined legislations, laws, statutory acts, and guidance, as I said. And in fact, if you're interested, there is a nice collection of such items one can find in what is called as Global AI Law and Policy Tracker, which is published by IAPP, which is International Association of Privacy Professionals. One can really search that on Google and you'll find those details. As I said, this is a topic by itself, and it will perhaps be covered or in a separate discussion. my intent is not to really get into this. My intent is to get into international standards and framework. So on international standards, they typically complement what is called as legal frameworks and offer practical guidance for practice implementation. So essentially translating some of the requirements of the acts or the statutory requirements into specific practices. And we'll speak about this a little later in subsequent slides. Then there are something called as industry best practices. Very interesting because these are derived for specific sectors, and they of course come from standards which we defined earlier, and specific sectors such as healthcare, financials, manufacturing, and many others. Then the other thing is platforms and tools. They typically comprise of hardware and software technologies which are used for building AI solutions. And you guys are aware that this includes a wide array of solutions, such as any ALLM or SLM, or for that matter, in managed services, you will find tools related to ITSM or ITEM. And there are quite a few tools which are available in the market which use nowadays a lot of AI at back end. Again, as I said, this is a large subject of interest and should be covered separately in a different forum, in a different session. But more importantly, I think we are going to concentrate largely from the standards into the organizational framework, which refers to the structure through which an organization formulates its own policies, practices, guidelines, and operational procedures. Essentially, it represents a unique operational methodology of the organization, and I always call it as organization way of working. So we'll look at what are the aspects we really need to get into, and this is where actually the details will start flowing in when you have to define certain processes and procedures and governance around AI solutions while adopting AI solutions. Lastly, there is engagements and processes and checklist. It is basically nothing but tailoring your organizational processes for specific engagements. We will not get into more details on this, but we will look at some of the practices which are employed, especially on the quality assurance activities or what is called as assessment. So this all is covered as a part of overall adoption. So the reason why I put this particular slide is that people, especially the enterprises and organizations, have to be aware that this is what drives your overall governance, risk management, processes, and procedure when you're adopting or using, either ways, an overall AI solution. All right. What I'm going to do is, in this particular slide, I'm going to explore some international standards which were developed for AI. And from the list, obviously, you'll be surprised that there are quite a few standards. And what I've done here is, taken up largely ISO IEC standards. And thanks to this organization for establishing such strong standards over many years, because otherwise it would not have been possible to really build some of the strong practices within the organization. While I'm going to discuss the standards, what I've done is I've divided them into the broad 5 categories, which are basically nothing but management systems, standards and guidelines, frameworks, vocabulary, and text specs and reports and use cases. This is just a grouping which I have done. And what we'll do is we'll look at the examples of each one of them. I'll start from the left-hand side, management systems. These are the one which actually drive your overall organization systems and processes. And the examples of this are, of course, you are aware of quality management system. You probably, if you're working in IT software services industry, you are also aware of security management system. And attached with security management system, there is something called as risk management system. And recently, last year in December, I also defined what is called as AI management system, or ISO 42000. We'll get into the management system characteristics and ISO 42000 later, because that is the one which is an overarching framework. What follows after that is standards and guidelines. So if you look at standards and guidelines, typically you would notice that the guidelines are related to risk management, and you have two types of risk management today exist. One is generic risk management in IT services and provisions, and recently they have also defined what is called as risk management related to AI, which we'll look into when we look at integration of standards later. What I want to also talk about is the privacy management system, or privacy information management system, or PIM as it is called. This is something which has been introduced recently as an add-on for ISO 27000, a security management system, and it deals with a lot of requirements from the privacy perspective. And as you read, the requirements, you would notice that most of the privacy requirements, including the GDPR requirements, are covered as a part of that particular system. So I think these are standards and guidelines. I'll not go through each one of them. On the framework side, of course, there are frameworks related to data lifecycle framework or big data. Just one word here is, or one point to note here is that when you're talking about AI, three components largely play important role. One is the AI itself, which is basically building models or adopting, models which are already available. The other is, of course, the security aspect, which is very important. And third is the data part. Hence, you would notice that I have picked up some of the standards which are related to each other. One more important aspect which ISO does is that, it is important to define what is called as vocabularies, because definitions will keep, changing from the organizational enterprise perspective. So they wanted to make sure that the concepts and the terminologies which are used while depicting and defining processes in the frameworks, they have defined something called as vocabulary. So one has to really look at those closely in order to make sure that they are used in the right context. Last but not the least is tech specs or reports or use cases. This is a category which I have created separately. It's not available outside. It's separately in the sense that it talks about various use cases. There are different tech specifications based on the experiences of people who have used that in the industry, and there are certain reports. So some of the examples are AI use cases, which is getting built as we speak. And you would notice asterisks, and those asterisks typically mean that either they are getting revised or they are still getting built. And of course, there are quite a few others. One of the things which I found very important is treatment of unwanted bias, which is second last on the left-hand side list. This is something which is going to be very useful. This typically help you to build some of the controls and checks within your organization when you're developing your organization framework. All right. So I was speaking about management systems, and management systems typically do something called as building an overarching framework. So we will quickly go into management system and the definition of management system as we speak, and how it is understood otherwise in the organization. Management system typically serve as a comprehensive guidelines, right, that organizations should examine while implementing strategies. They are instrumental typically in fostering processes, repeatability. Repeatability is more important, and of course, continuous improvement culture. Now, this is an overarching document which also looks at overall governance. And I'll show you that. You'll see that in ISO 42000 standard when you speak about this. They also talk about standards, the aspects related to leadership, governance, policies, practices, and outlining specific requirements with respect to a certain domain. Now, if you look at management systems, they are developed through a consensus of internal experts. So obviously, people sit there, develop this, go through the stages, define, and then the release. So So they typically go through almost 10 to 12 stages before it is outlined and released to the uh, released out to the organizations to adopt. Okay. Now, I think it is important to understand that there are certain requirements which are stated as a part of the management system, and I'll show you those requirements. They are called as controls and, of course, clauses, and they are typically used for you know uh, especially used in confirmation requirements. If you are going for certification, they're used as proof of adherence or evidences to these standards. And you can very clearly see some of the management standards which we spoke earlier are also reflected here in terms of 42,000 or 27,000. 9,000 is the quality management system which most of the people or the organizations are adhered to. ISO 31,000 is related to the risk management guideline, which came along with 27,000. Very, very important risk management and treatment guidance. So these are some characteristics with respect to management standards. What I'll do now is to move into ISO 42,000 specifically. ISO 42,000 is also called as AI Management System Standard. It is 42,001 2023, released in 2023. There are quite a few other guidelines and frameworks are coming as we speak. It is basically world's first AI management system, which was eagerly awaited by enterprises, regulators, solution providers, and many others. Because what happened was that the technology went ahead and actually came out with various solutions. And then, there's adoption which happened without any particular care. So there was a need. While on the other side, if you look at the other side of the spectrum, there are laws, regulations, and acts coming up. But there's no one which was bridging these two sides in between. Typically, laws will tell you what needs to be done, but how needs to be done is something which the management system typically tell you with the help of tools and best practices which come in. So it was eagerly awaited. It tackles a lot of concerns which include ethics, transparency, security, responsible use of AI, as well as managing risks and opportunities within AI. And when I say AI or adoption of AI, I mean either you use AI, you use AI tool or practices, or you develop your own solutions, or you act as buying some licenses from third party. So it actually covers all. This particular system in ISO 42,000 specifically sets out requirements of leadership, planning, operation. So if you looked at previous and understood previous characteristics of management system, all characteristics are captured here. For example, let's say putting policies, procedures, sound governance, which was already there as part of the management system. Okay, setting structured way to manage risks and opportunities, which we spoke earlier also. So these are some things which are already covered as a part of ISO 42,000. More importantly, I think it defines specific control objectives and controls that must be employed. And this is again characteristics of management system. You will see those specific controls and control objectives in ISO 27,000, which is your security standard. You almost have close to 140 controls which need to be defined, and of course, which are applicable to your organization, and to see how you really employ them in your organization. And these controls are the ones which are used to determine, you satisfy or conform to the requirements of this particular standard. So I think we will speak about those controls as we go to the next slide. But more importantly, I think ISO 42,000 brings in a value add with respect to traceability, transparency, reliability, risks, and responsible use if adopted in the way it is expected. All right, so these are now details, and I will probably, talk a few things in this particular details. What this slide presents is various clauses and controls included in the standard. Okay. One of the things which you need to carefully consider is their implications. So one is adopting them as it is. Second is adopting for your business needs. Third is, what does it mean by adopting it? So you'll have to do what is called as implications or impact assessment. And we'll speak about those impact assessment a little later. So if you look at, let's say, these boxes typically represent what is called as clauses in the organization. So there is a context. The context is basically nothing but context of employing business practices, including AI practices, with respect to your business. So what is that context? And the context is typically internal perspective and external perspective. What are the needs need to be defined? So these are all definitions which need to be done as a part of your organizational framework. What are the expectations of the interested parties? And there are quite a few interested parties. We normally, take them under what is called as stakeholders. Okay. Then on the leadership side, it talks about what is the leadership commitment, and that's where values and missions will be defined, and also commitment in terms of roles and responsibilities and authorities, and accountability will be defined. But more importantly, I think it is important to define AI policy. I have a slide on policies, which I'll explain how one can really derive some of the policies on one side. Well, I'll take a few more and then we'll move on to the controls. The other one is the planning side. So planning is typically nothing but related to addressing your overall objectives and plans to achieve in the organization. So you really write down your plans. You write down what is called as your overall goals or strategies, and you also write what is called as initiatives with respect to the strategy, and how do you want to achieve those initiatives with respect to AI when it comes to planning. You also address your risks and opportunities and define how are you going to manage changes. This is something which is underestimated many a times when it comes to planning. I will take operations. I'll skip support for the want of time. So operation planning is another one which is important. This is where what we call it as details come in. How do you develop? How do you acquire? How do you use your AI solutions? What are the risks associated with those operations? So how do you make AI risk assessment and treatment? AI risk assessment and treatment is very important, and therefore one needs to really define its boundary in terms of how do you manage that. And what is the impact? I spoke about this impact earlier. What are the impacts with respect to with respect to AI implementation? And there is a guidance which is coming in terms of how do you really do AI systems impact. Then, of course, there is performance and monitoring and measurement and evaluation, internal audit. We'll speak about one example of how do you do assessment or internal audit. So actually all characteristics which I spoke about a little earlier have been covered in this particular standard. And of course, there is a list of implementation guidelines for controls. We'll speak about this as we go to the next slide. Okay. Pretty busy slide. You don't have to worry, don't have to go through this everything. This is an example which I picked up from the controls which are defined. And you can very clearly see there are close to 100 controls. I have not yet counted, but I would imagine if security systems have 148 controls, I'm sure they will be equal or more. But what I'm trying to say here is these are the controls which need to be employed or adopted in terms of either operational process or a policy or a typical check, what we call it as toll gate check in your processes. So from the AI policy perspective, you need to have, do you have a business strategy, or do you have something called as risk appetite? How do you manage risks? Is your organization defined very clearly, roles, responsibilities defined? So you can see some of the repetitions which have come in, but these are translated into controls and checks. Okay, with respect to resources, whether you have resources, what are your data resources? What are your tools? What kind of system resources do you use? or computing resources to use? How do you control them? What kind of security is built around them, right? How do you manage human resources? How do you manage their uh, understanding and training and many other factors related to human resources, because they are going to run the systems. Then, of course, assessing the impacts of AI. So impact is related to either legal side or a physical side or a human rights side, and we'll talk about some examples later. On the data side, of course, what is your data requirement? First of all, define what is a data requirement. How do you control data? How do you build your training and testing uh, data? How do you store them? Where do you store them and how do you retrieve? How do you maintain privacy of that data and security and accuracy? So if you actually look at all this, and last one, it's important because we don't necessarily, and I've seen this in my experience, we don't necessarily, you know, uh, emphasize on putting strong practices around interested parties and third party and customer. I think those are the ones which need to be really looked at when it comes to controls. And this particular control really expects you to put in certain processes, checks, and methods to manage interested parties, evaluating their risks, and making sure that we are transparent with respect to that particular uh, group. And of course, accountability of partner suppliers is another aspect which is important for us to consider. So these are controls. And if you look at, let's say, the construct which we spoke about clauses, right? And and the requirements, and we spoke about controls. That's how a standard is defined. There are more details, of course, I have just represented in a very summarized form. But we also spoke in the earlier slides on ISO 9000, ISO 20000, 27000, and so on and so forth. I think it is kind of apparent to talk about this. So here what I'm doing is basically trying to explain you certain standards that work seamlessly together. Uh, you know, well, you may be familiar with the one which is on the left-hand side, which is ISO 9001, which is a quality management standards. Standards like ISO 27000 and ISO 27001, 27071 play a role in establishing a solid CIA. For those who don't know what is CIA, is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So they establish, they actually, make CIA strategy strong. They also help in establishing security of assets, managing risk associated with it, as well as aligning controls with respect to that. On other side, if you look at AI impact assessment, this is something which is coming up, 42005 ISO. This is still in discussion mode, probably will be released very soon. But I think it's important to take into consideration the requirements of this particular impact assessment. It talks about how do you do impact, when do you do impact, what kind of impact or what kind of implications will be there for a particular action. All that is stated in terms of guidance. Eventually, the actions or recommendations from this will merge, I think, into what is called as AI risk management process. Of course, we spoke about others like vocabulary. There are AI concepts and terminology which are defined. It also defines AI system lifecycle at this point of time. I'm told that this is undergoing a little change. Then there is, of course, governance implication, uh, related standard. And the one on the left-hand side are, we spoke earlier. One thing which I wanted to speak about is there is a specific guidance related to AI risk management, which talks about how do you manage risks in AI projects, and there is a guidance related to that given. So you would notice that there is something called as ISO 31000, which is overall risk management, and AI risk management. I would tend to think over a period of time when AI becomes business as usual, both those risk management standards may get an opportunity to get merged, but that's for the later side. Okay, so having seen what standards are. So we spoke about three things. We spoke about characteristic of standard. We spoke about the ISO 42000 standard. We spoke about clauses in the 42000. We spoke about controls. I think for us as an organization, we have to now make sure that we convert that into what is called as an organizational framework. So what are we looking at? We are looking at a mechanism to translate the guidelines from the earlier standards into an organizational framework. It effectively outlines policies, processes, strategies necessary for the engagement within an organization. Again, at this point of time, I just want to tell you that this is organization framework. And if people are aware, it is also called as quality management system in some organizations, or in earlier organizations, we used to call it as business management system. So effectively, we are defining what is called as quality management system or business management system. This encompasses everything from developing strategies, values, missions, to setting long-term goals. And, with respect to, this particular business, it also defines AI policies. What are your comprehensive method of governance? It will also talk about operational planning, executions. That's where your SDLC for any life cycle, whether it's a standard IT SDLC, AI life cycle, maintenance life cycle. So it actually talks about how do you define your processes related to operations, and talks about execution, quality assurance, performance management. In effect, you would notice that it is pretty comprehensive enough, and it has to be comprehensive enough. And this is where, the devil lies. You may understand laws, regulations, acts, you may understand standards, but you cannot adopt them in your operational processes without this particular step. So this is basically translation for your business. And if you look at these 4 factors, and this is what I have put, this is not a standard thing. You may add more onto the organized framework, but typically talks about value missions on one side, your internal governance and organization on the other side. Aspect within that governance, which I want to refer to, is basically something related to how do you manage risks. And there are some committees which probably are preferred to be at any point of time. In the era of security and quality management system, there used to be management security committee. You would need a AI steering committee at some point of time. On the organizational way of working or operational processes, one of course defines policies and processes. We'll define program management plans, and this is not very different. And I have taken in subsequent slides, I've taken few examples of an architecture from the process perspective and an example of an ETVX, just to demonstrate or illustrate how one needs to go into details of developing an organizational framework. I think it is also important to look at performance management from the metrics and goals and course corrections and baselining perspective and benchmarking perspective. This is a very typical standard requirement, but standard also believes primarily on bringing in a culture of continuous improvement. And you cannot do continuous improvement without really doing all these activities. And there may be more in this organizational framework. This was just used as an illustration for that matter. And therefore, for any engagement, if you want to use this, these are the processes which are typically used. Okay. I'm taking examples. So before I go there, I just want to tell you that we are talking about policies. We are talking about operational processes. So I've taken some examples in this. I will not go through each one of them. When you're deriving policy, what is policy? Policy is nothing but your intent, what you want to do. It's a mandate. It actually stays above the process. You may have a one-liners which says that I will limit the use for this particular solution or for data, and it will be in line with my company values and principles. This is what AI use regulation policy will be. I'll give you an analogy if people are getting confused. If you look at HR policy, HR policies, you have to draft policies related to attendance, leave management, performance, uh, remuneration, and many other policies. If you don't have those policies, then it will be, end of the game, which effectively means that it guides you to say that this is the mandate. What standard, ISO 42000 standard also says that you have to define your AI policies. However detailed they may be, they need to be mandated. In one of the organizations where I'm consulting at this point of time, what I've also done is I have used these policies to very effectively to define very clearly some of the mandates or the rules in automation. So this policies do help in that area as well. But coming back to the policies on AI, there are policies which could be related to legal compliance, human AI balance, which is very important, ethical considerations in terms of how ethical and responsible AI framework which you have developed. And what I've also done is on the right-hand side is pointers to where they can be put. So bias monitoring could probably go into, in your policies and your quality assurance, and something called as fairness metrics. I find fairness metrics, just a little digression, fairness metrics is a very important aspect when it comes to implementing fair, non-bias, legal, protected, secure AI policies. And I think this is subject of a different discussion probably, but people who are interested maybe interested to look at fairness metrics. This is a very interesting topic, incidentally, which I recently stumbled upon. But coming back to the policies, so these are policies. These are policies which are defined, and they have to be defined ahead. Something which you probably start right in the beginning when you're drafting your organization framework. All right, so next 3 slides is about key operations and something which I have used in my earlier write-up. It's available on aithoughts.org when we were developing some of the requirements of ML ops, or what we call it as ML security ops. Why is it here? Primarily because it tells you an overall architecture which one needs to really look at and define when it comes to operational processes by way of identifying key modules. So for example, and I have numbered them, so you can go through those numbers a little later, but when it comes to problem definition, requirement management, what are your processes related to that? So the detailed processes which need to be defined. Then you get into the model development. Now this is basically for ML ops. So obviously this is for machine learning solution or AI machine learning solution. So when it comes to model development, what are your basic ideas of continuous build? And then, for example, let's say you're talking about training management. So you're going to do continuous training. Now imagine that you are actually churning out a series of AI ML solutions. One needs to really go through this on a continuous manner. And therefore you'll see continuous training, continuous exploration, continuous build are the words which are used here, because this is a continuous thing. In case if it is not continuous, meaning it's a one-time requirement, then of course you go through all that, but you go through particular stage once. Then there is of course evaluation and test management, which talks about continuous testing, and then continuous integration, which is basically your CI/CD when it comes to deployment, containerization, deployment, and then productionizing. But I think it's important to define this in detail. It has to be end to end. If you look at it, this particular thing talks about right from problem definition to deployment to managing, serving, to repository, registry maintenance, to monitoring and improvement. So it's end to end. It has to be detailed. And in the next slide, we'll talk about one or two examples, not all, in terms of how do you translate this high-level picture into your operational process. This is a pretty standard way of doing it. It does apply to AI/ML as well, and hence I have taken examples of AI/ML. But just to go back, what we're saying, we are saying that we are defining organizational framework from the standards, and from there we are defining details. So this is a pretty good example of end-to-end architecture. As I said, there's a write-up exists on AiThoughts. You may want to go through this probably in detail. Well, this is my pet slide, which I use in many presentations, and I've used it effectively in some of the organization, including the consultancy, which I do. Primarily, this is, as we always say, there are, the devil is in the detail. So if you look at this particular aspect, there are details. And I'm not going to go through those details. It is only for your understanding. But you have to get down to saying that what kind of tasks you will perform for a given lifecycle stage. What are the inputs which are required? What kind of criteria you will define? What kind of output you will get? What is the mechanism to define that my output is sufficient enough? This is where the criteria comes in for output. And I also put in some security considerations, and I'll take one example. I'll run through that particular row. What is probably missing and perhaps missing and has not been put in here primarily because of lack of space is the RACI. Who will do what? Who's responsible? Who's consuming it? Who's informed, and so on and so forth. I'll take example of model build. So what do you require as inputs? Basically requirements, right? And the data which is annotated, right? Basically converted into features. You require features. You may have an opportunity to, identify multiple models. So you may probably have one or two identified models. And if there are any coding standards, including security standards. So when you're building this, you require that. And the typical tasks which you perform are building a model. So you create a model pipeline. Prior to that, you also create data pipeline. When you create a model pipeline, you do coding, testing, security testing, training models with the training data, and evaluating, and so on and so forth. So there are many such stages. What is the output of this model? The output, of course, is trained and, more importantly, evaluated model. You actually package this into a containerization or containerize that as a package and then deploy it maybe in the staging area, and once you're satisfied, into the production area. Okay, and then output, of course, are various reports and evaluation metrics. And interestingly, there are quite a few evaluation metrics which are available in the organization to identify whether a model performs well. And you would have heard about confusion metrics as a metrics which is used ideally in ensuring some of these models perform well. So you can define recall, precision, accuracy kind of models in this. All right, and then there, of course, security considerations in terms of application code scans, etc., etc. This is what happens. So coming back, you have to define those details, and that's why I was saying it is basically nothing but details. Devil is in the details, and if you don't have this, there is no way you can have a continuous process which is run on its own. You cannot have a quality product coming out. You cannot pinpoint an issue in case if there is an issue, and so on and so forth. So from standards to organizational framework, from organizational framework to policies, from policies to processes. And then finally, it is important for us to understand an assessment framework example. And this I will actually leave it to you guys to read. For any process quality assurance person, this is nothing but your audit framework. what this example highlights are several factors to be considered when evaluating or auditing an AI/ML solution. So, there are checks and balances typically related to data collection, preparation, model development, as we saw in the ATBX diagram, or there are checks related to interpretability and explainability, important algorithmic accountability. This is something which is also turned as a uh, as a as a guidance act or a law in US, if I'm not mistaken. So this is something which you will have to bring in. Some of the requirements of the acts or standards or laws will also come in this. So if you notice on the left hand side, you are talking about ethical compliance, regulatory compliance, and you have to actually sit down and write what does those check mean. But you need that framework, because if you don't need that framework, if you don't define that framework, then you'll land up in a situation where everything is free for everyone. So just to summarize, what we did was we started from organized standards, laws. Sorry, we started with laws. We looked at what are the statutory requirements, some examples, but we got into the standards. What kind of standards are there? Then we defined what is called as organizational framework, policies, detailed operational process, and then we got into assessment framework uh, as we speak. So in conclusion, what are we saying? So standards play a crucial role in shaping our robust strategies and practices within the organization. Having said that, adoption of AI solutions tools is not very robust as we speak today. It is still in the development stages. And parallelly, you would notice that there is a evolution of numerous laws, regulations, and even standards are undergoing a lot of changes. And then, of course, there is emergence of generative AI, which poses a very significant challenge, as highlighted by some of the examples below, such as transparency or consent. How do you really take care of transparency or consent or individual rights or purpose limitation or data minimization, storage limitation? Some of these requirements obviously are coming from Privacy Act, or if you are familiar with GDPR, this is what is stated very clearly as a part of that particular requirement. So how do you really take care of those examples or those kind of requirements when it comes to generative AI? And therefore, it is recommended that one needs to carefully plan and implement this in a very limited area and monitor them closely when it comes to GenAI solutions. With this, I think what I'll do is uh, I will end my presentation. You would agree that these topics were pretty extensive and very detailed. What I've done is I've attempted to summarize as much as possible. Thank you for your time and patient hearing. I'll hand over to Divakar for any QA if required.
Hey, thanks, Anil. That was a super overview of all the standards and the way AI development, responsible AI development, let me put it that way, is progressing, right? I'll wait for questions. I do have a few of my own, but I'll wait for others to ask their questions, and then please unmute yourself and you can ask, or you can type it into the chat window, and I can ask you.
Thank you, Anil. This is Ravichandran. Basically, super.
Yes, sir.
I think that first of all, we want to thank you for spending by kind of making all this into a basically capsule to be talked about in 50 minutes. Is a huge, basically tremendous job. And thanks for taking your time out and doing this. And this again, just wanted to highlight the whole idea and the vision of AiThoughts that we will discuss, share your ideas on AI for enterprise, because end of the day, these models are good. They are all tools to be used to solve a business problem. And while people may be thinking, I think one of the major things which people have to realize is get away from the magic, mysticism. Some people think it is superhuman, it is God. Basically, magic, you ask a question, answer comes out. To basically saying, how do we deploy it in an enterprise within the laws of the country, laws of the countries they operate in, within their own mission statement and vision and their brand name. And then only you realize that whatever you talked about is so relevant. And anybody who does shortcut, because you might have seen the way Boeing has gone. Just imagine if Boeing was in an industry where there are 6 to 10 players, they would have been closed down by now. They are surviving because there are only 2 players in the whole world, and whole world wants to fly. And otherwise, with the kind of and what were the issues? Basically, the quality process, what he called a business process, was diluted to the extent that they were putting kind of planes in the air where the door is not closing, and as basic as that, and so fantastic. And I think you also highlighted the point about ethical kind of fairness metrics, which is very important, because that is something which is becoming more and more important. As you've seen in the last few years, social media companies, to the extent some of them are boycotting advertisements of large companies, and so very important that there should not be any very inappropriate basically things coming out of your AI systems, whether it is chatbot or whether it's a customer care, whether it is selection of vendors or approving mortgage loans, student loans, admissions into college. I mean, there are going to be thousands of these business applications. Everywhere there is a sitting time bomb, which could create very image problems to the customers. And so very important. I think that the way your 30 years back when we all started the Indian IT industry, there were similar kind of talk saying about ISO is very big. Why do you need all this? We can code and deploy. And then slowly the industry understood that the scale, the number of applications, the time frame, and the kind of importance and the make or break these systems can do. We started deploying, and I'm sure the similar thing will happen. Basically, in this field also, fantastic. And I think there is going to be a lot more on the Gen AI, which I'm sure that next time you got a chance, you can talk about. Basically, what is happening is what was the latest research even 1 year back has become outdated. So the whole explainability. So we were talking about how do you build explainability. This is prior to ChatGPT. And now with all the big models of billions of parameters, if you ask explainability, people will laugh that time. You can't. Where do you go and check in 175 billion parameter model? Which neuron gave this kind of answer? God only knows. So I think explainability part is going to become very important, because that would be the minimum requirement in every country. When you make a decision which is affecting the life of a human being, then you tell why did he make a decision and what changes the person needs to do to pass the exam. Suppose you fail a person, You say, I failed you because of 5 questions. You didn't answer the 3 questions correctly. And if you take the re-exam and the answer is correctly, you will get it. And so you cannot say, no, all I can tell you is you failed. We can't tell you how to, or apply for a home mortgage, apply for a student admission. So a lot of interesting things, fantastic. I think 42,000 is going to can stay with us for a long time. And really appreciate what your research and then compilation of this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ravi. Anyone, any questions in the audience? Feel free to.
Yeah, hi, Anil. Yeah, Anil, this is Yashwant.
Hey, hi, Yashwant.
I think your presentation brings back or pulls out all the euphoria around GenAI implementation, adaptation in enterprise, and brings focus back to the fundamental of implementing controls and processes around it. So based on what you have observed or what your research says, when enterprises are embarking upon adopting a AI or Gen AI solution or product, etc., into their business processes, manufacturing processes, business processes, or whatever. How it works in the sense, should they build this process control foundation first and embark upon that, or they do it parallelly? What comes first, what comes next? What is the general thought process around it?
It only is possible to start afresh if you are starting the business afresh. But otherwise, what happens is that if you're already into the market and then you are now adopting processes, then it is catching up. So then what you do is you would typically have policies around building, constructing, and so on and so forth, not formally defined. You'll end up in writing them. But if you're adopting this frameworks for the first time and business is also afresh, I think it is important. That's what the standard also says, to define policies first. Policy is important, and then you define your overall architecture, and thereafter you define your controls. I think that's the way to follow. But answering your question, especially with respect to GenAI, and I have kept it as a comment and not more in details here, because if you look at from the data protection principles, and I'm actually alluding to what even Ravi sir was saying earlier, if you look at data protection principles, for example, consent, just for an argument, you would notice that there is no way, a practical way to obtain consent for processing of personal data, especially when the GenAI products or solutions or LLM products and solutions are defined. One of the other requirement is purpose limitation. So what is the purpose? Why are you doing this? Purposes, when it comes to generative AI, GenAI solutions, it actually evolves over a period of time. It is not defined very clearly. It evolves, it studies on its own, and then defines a certain amount of outcome. So is the case with the data and storage limitation or individual rates. So, I mean, answering question, there is a way of doing it when you start afresh, and that is defining policies and processes. But when it comes to let's say businesses which are already existing, you probably have to do a little bit of bottom-up approach as well in terms of understanding what processes exist today. And I brought that example of GenAI because that brings that is a different animal altogether.
Correct, exactly. Yeah.
What is happening, Yashwant, is I think the magic, the mysticism, and that is overtaking common sense.
Correct.
I think a lot of people are asking for money, and the CIO and the CEOs are basically forced to sign off on projects, and they don't get the head of risk management, head of kind of quality management, that type of function get involved. And then the same thing what Andrew Ng talked about even 3-4 years back, that pilot to production paradox.
Yeah.
So they will do pilot, they will show a demo to the CXOs, everyone is happy, and the CXO will say, roll it out. And then you bring in the data risk manager, then you bring in IT risk manager, digital risk
And they will
manager.
put the brakes.
They will basically say, what is it? And suppose you are rolling out a chatbot. First thing you have to do is on the transparency part, you have to start the conversation with saying that you are talking to your AI agent. And if you want a human agent, the queue may be longer, but you can get out. That is a requirement of the EU Act also, that they should have transparency and they should have options to deal with kind of human agent. And say that is not there. And he said, no, we actually closed the call center. There is no option. And then it gets into a problematic stuff. So starting with transparency, consent, and then maybe the data model selected runs on a different kind of cloud. And the data security people, the IT security people have signed off on Microsoft Azure and say, no, we need to do additional testing and certification before letting your model cloud into the enterprise. And that will take another 3 months. And so it is basically delays are happening. So only the most important lessons from Anil's topic is that this is not magic. There is no mysticism involved. This is a great technology, but you have to do, you have to follow the similar process. And of course, you can actually use the AI to speed up the process, but there is no shortcut. Either do it manually or do it automatically, or say automation tools. But what you have to do, and like Anil said, the best thing is to spend the time, get all the stakeholders, like what AiThoughts we have recommended. Basically, get your AI steering committee, which involves all these people, and get a COE so that they can get pre-certified, pre-security cleared, and so pilot to production happens within a month's time or something like that. So basically more and more people are required to help and advise, and not so much in saying I can develop a Gen AI solution for you. I know how to do prompt engineering, I know how to do, but basically telling the enterprise, how are we going to strategize, develop policies, strategies, and then get this thing going so they can, it is not to get enterprise spend money, they have to get returns also.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. Thank you, Anil.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else? Any questions that you have for Anil?
Yeah, Diwakar, George, Anil, a short comment. Thanks for this. It's very useful. It's a lot of effort behind this. Just curious to know, even if you keep aside the Gen AI and what's happening off late in the traditional ML world, I'm sure that it's being used in the banking, maybe for fraud, for pricing in the retail, supply chain predictions. Do you know of some organizations or where some of these standards or inklings of these getting used as a practice, or anything like a directionally? Yeah, there's some companies moved the needle. This is there for last 8-9 years now, at least in the latest avatar.
No, I don't think ISO 42000 has been used, but I can I know two organizations, I can't name them here, but are using standard ML related lifecycle strategies. One, of course, is in fraud detection area. Other one is actually IT services, providing certain kind of solutions to the customer. But they are largely what I stated in ETBX. Some of the examples or some of the some of the items which were quoted in 80 weeks, my slide came from that experience.
Okay.
But not many, I must confess. I haven't really seen so many. And I think, like Ravi sir was saying, it is not magic. It is important to define them upfront. I think,
Yeah.
but at the same time, also bring balance between the standards and frameworks and operational processes and innovative solutions which are in the market. And I think
Yeah.
that maturity is still away at this point of time.
Yeah, and one reason for that could be that even though these AI engines throwing out some results, maybe there's a human oversight there. So finally, it may get wrapped into that process, which will take care of any kind of risk and eventual fallouts.
Yes, you're right.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Anil. I think we're way past our time also. Anybody else? Any questions? Feel free to put it out. Raise your hand now. Otherwise, no. All right, Anil, thanks a lot. I really appreciate the effort that you have taken to bring such a vast, a vast crucible of knowledge into and condense it into this 45, 50, 1 hour session. Really great, and thanks a lot for your time and your efforts.
Sure.